Hello again, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Silver Bullion Television SBTV. I'm your host, Patrick Vieira. Once again, if you are new to this channel or you have not already done so, please do subscribe, click on the bell to be notified on new updates, and do give us a thumbs up if you like what we do. We appreciate your support. Our guest today is David Stockman, who is the former director of the Office of Management and Budget under President Ronald Reagan and was the youngest cabinet member of the 20th century. His 20-year career in the financial industry has seen him in executive positions with the Blackstone Group and Solomon Brothers Incorporated. He's also the author of several books, including his latest book, Peak Trump, The Undrainable Swamp, and The Fantasy of MAGA. It's our honor to have him here today as our guest. Good day, David, and welcome to SBTV. How are you doing?
Very good, and happy to be with you. There's a lot of big issues to talk about.
Oh,
World's
yes.
going crazier by the day, I think.
Oh, it is definitely getting crazier by the day. But, part of that news is the Fed rate cut. If we can, let's start with that Fed rate cut. And for the first time in 10 years, we saw them make a cut, 25 basis points off the already low Fed funds rate. And but I gotta start looking at the future by going in the past, where if you and Paul Volcker were having a cup of coffee this morning, what would the two of you be saying about the recent actions of the Fed?
Well, I would be horrified, and I wouldn't be surprised if he felt the same. This rate cut was a act of colossal stupidity and cowardice. It was a capitulation to the bully in the Oval Office and the crybabies and gamblers on Wall Street who can never get enough sugar from the Fed. But let's look at the underlying case. There is no economic case for it whatsoever. After all, supposedly we're at a 50-year low on unemployment. We're at a 20-year high on consumer confidence. The GDP is growing at least modestly in the 2 to 3% range. And this is not an economy that needs stimulus 121 months into an expansion. We're at a record. Now, what we do need is honest financial asset prices. What we do need is interest rates that make sense. We haven't had them for the last decade or longer. And now the Fed, after a tiny effort to normalize rates, has, reversed course and is marching right back into what I call, sub-zero insanity. I want to just make one point on this that we have such a recency bias. By that I mean what happened yesterday or last week, that we forget where we've been and where we've come from. Now, we had the funds rate, which is the key rate that drives Wall Street trading, because after all, overnight money is the mother's milk of speculators, and if you give it to them free, they're just going to speculate, until they eventually blow things up. But the point is, the federal funds rate turned negative in real terms in April 2008. In other words, the funds rate dropped below the inflation rate on a running basis at that time for 126 months straight. Through November 2018, the funds rate was below the trend inflation rate, like on a year-over-year basis. Nothing like it in history. That was negative real cost money, and it caused a tremendous reflation of Wall Street, but it did nothing, obviously, for Main Street. We can look at the results, the weakest recovery in history. I look at real final sales rather than real GDP, because you take the distortions from inventory fluctuations out of the number. But in any event, since the pre-crisis peak in 2007, before we went into the soup, so to speak, real GDP has grown at 1.6% annually for the last 11 and a half years. That's half what it was historically. In other words, what I'm saying is we had all this massive monetary stimulus. We all know how much the balance sheets of the Fed and other central banks expanded. We had real interest rates on the money market below inflation, and yet we ended up not only with an economy that grew at half its historic rate, but with a very unbalanced growth in which industrial production, and that's the heart of any economy still today. You can't live on Pilates instructors and services alone. So if we look at the industrial economy today, 11 and a half years after all of this madness started, it's 5% larger than it was 11 and a half years ago. That's barely moved. All this stimulus and the industrial economy in the U.S. is up 5%. Manufacturing output today, as measured by the Federal Reserve Index, is still 2% below where it was in the summer of 2007. So to summarize, we've had monetary madness, 126 months of negative rates, and then we finally got a smidgen of positive real yield in December when they raised the rates the last time. They raised the funds rate to 2.4%. If you look at any inflation measure you want, I like the core CPI, takes out the volatility of energy and food, but okay. The core CPI is up 2.15% year over year in June. The funds rate they set at 2.4. That's 25 basis points of real yield, barely enough to write home about, a tiny sliver of actual real interest rate, and yet they've already turned tail and reduced the rate because they got so much pressure from Wall Street and from the White House. Now that tells you what, I would say, what a dilemma, what a pickle, what a real disaster we're in when we have a central bank that's as foolhardy and as cowardly and as they have their heads stuck in the sand, buried in the sand of Keynesian mythology. It's getting us into big trouble.
Yeah, you mentioned December and Jay Powell, and I think that was the month where Trump had called Jay Powell or the Fed crazy, and so I got to ask: is Fed Chair Jerome Powell implementing Fed policy the way he wants?
Who knows? I think it's not just Trump. I mean, Trump is a complete ignoramus when it comes to monetary policy. Uh, as far as he's concerned, let's not have any interest rates at all. Let's make them zero and let everybody borrow till their heart's content. That's how he ran his life as a real estate developer for 40 years. The cheaper the interest rates, the more money he made, because it was all, leverage speculation in New York real estate that he was fortunate enough to participate in at a time when the Fed was inflating every, financial asset in sight. So he has no idea what he's talking about. These tweets are, they're ridiculous. They're the sentiments of, ignoramus, as I said. The Fed, though, I think their problem is it is now so caught up in its own groupthink and the delusion that it has that it is actually managing the 20 trillion U.S. economy, that by minor changes in rhetoric, I call it open mouth policy, or small changes in interest rates, 25 basis points, from this low, ultra low level that we're at today, that they can affect the inflation rate or the growth rate or the course of the economy. They can't. This is a global economy. It's $80 trillion worth of goods and services being pushed and pulled all around the planet. Inflation is driven on a global basis, not on a domestic basis. So the whole idea of what I call Keynesian monetary central planning, that you got one $20 trillion economy and that you have a valve called the interest rate that you can dial up or dial down, and you can make the inflation rate come out to the second decimal point, is crazy as hell. And yet that's what they think they're doing. They can't even see that they're waving their arms, at a windmill, and it's not making any difference. I mean, that's the problem today. Central banking run amok. Central banking controlled by a small posse of unelected academics and political hacks who somehow, one, believe that they're running the national and global economy, and second, have no checks and balances. So even though I think Trump is totally wrong and is coming from the wrong direction, anybody who attacks the Fed for whatever reason, I'm all for, because it's an illegitimate, dangerous institution that needs to have its credibility so undermined that finally the political authorities and the Congress in this country wake up and say we have delegated open-ended power to a Politburo of 12 people who are wrecking everything. They're killing savers. They're killing wage workers. They're creating massive windfall profits on Wall Street for speculators and traders. This isn't the route to prosperity. This isn't the route to a stronger economy. This is the route to a disaster.
Yeah. Are we already on the side of the line where it's end the Fed time, or is there a purpose for the Fed?
There is not a purpose for the FOMC, the Open Market Committee, constantly intervening every day, every week. There isn't a reason for the so-called Humphrey Hawkins objectives, which they constantly yapping about, our inflation target and our unemployment. These aren't realistic. They can't be achieved to the second decimal point in the kind of world we live in today. So my view is get rid of the FOMC, tell the Fed to stay out of the macro management, fine tuning, targeting, macro targeting of inflation, unemployment growth, and housing starts and all the other stuff that they seem to focus on. And set the Fed up, if you're going to keep it, as it was in 1913 when it was created. Carter, the original Carter Glass, the father of the Fed, he was chairman of the House Banking Committee. He wrote the legislation. Later, the Secretary of the Treasury. He was famous for Glass-Steagall and all that. But he believed the Fed was to be a banker's bank. It was to be a passive source of liquidity at a penalty rate of interest above whatever the market was setting. There was no targeting. There was no full employment goal. There was no macroeconomic writ. It was simply a backstop for liquidity, but at a penalty rate on good collateral. And one of the interesting things that people don't understand in the modern world is that the real Fed, this banker's bank, as he called it, was prohibited from owning any government security. It wasn't in the debt monetization business. It wouldn't have possibly had a 3.8 trillion balance sheet like it has today. So, your question, what should you do with the Fed? You probably ought to get rid of the whole damn thing, but if you can't go that far, get rid of the Humphrey Hawkins mandates. Tell it you're no longer in the macroeconomic business. We can see that monetary central planning doesn't work any better than the old-fashioned Soviet central planning did in Russia, or the mess they've got in China today. It has proved. And at the time, as I've written in some of my books, the Fed was to be composed not of PhDs in economics. I don't even think they had that many at the time. It was to be run by green eyeshade accountants who would look at the collateral presented by member banks, examine how sound and how collectible it was, and on the presentation of good collateral, it would advance loans at, as I say, a penalty rate of interest. That's what we need. Get rid of every damn PhD, every Jerome Powell, Washington apparatchik, which is what he is. Hire some good, accounting people who know how to examine balance sheets and financial statements. Let them make judgments on the collateral presented, and put the pressure on banks to go to the Fed when they desperately need liquidity and pay a penalty for it. Because I'll tell you what, banks would behave Much differently, if the Fed wasn't their friend, if the Fed was a harsh taskmaster that said, you want liquidity, why don't you liquefy your own balance sheet by shrinking your loan book or, uh, better matching your liabilities and assets. But if you insist on tapping these backup lines, put your collateral on the table. We'll discount it as we see fit, and you're going to pay a penalty for it. That's where we need to go. But the whole world is being run by central bankers. What's wrong with the free market? What's wrong with the hundreds of thousands of people this very moment who are trading something, currencies, swaps, stocks, whatever they're trading? What's wrong with the collective decision of the market of all these people to find what the stock market price ought to be, what the yield curve ought to be, what the overnight rate ought to be? Let them figure it out. These 12 people have no clue, nor do the other, idiots who run central banks in Europe or Japan. I mean, look at Draghi, for crying out loud. They've taken the balance sheet of the ECB, triple, quadruple. It's like 45% of GDP now. And they have a crisis in Europe because it's sliding quickly as we speak back into recession. You saw the German industrial
Oh yeah.
production numbers yesterday. Terrible, down 5% year over year. Now, this is after $3 trillion of quantitative easing since just 2014. What did it do? What it did was drive most of the yield curve of Germany into negative terms, and not just real here. I'm talking about nominal. We saw yesterday the Bund, 10-year Bund, clicked in at negative 6%, which is to say, the world is so crazy, and this is the ECB's doing along with the Fed and the rest, that for the privilege of loaning money for 10 years to Angela Merkel and company, you're going to get your $100, loan them $100, you're going to get 94 back
All right.
after 10 years, plus you're going to eat all the inflation and the interest. And this is pure madness. And we know that that isn't some isolated example. The fact is, as of yesterday, there was 15 trillion of negative yielding investment grade debt in the world, most of it sovereign, some of it corporate. That's a quarter of all the investment grade debt that trades on the global markets. And I'll give you an even more startling number, which somebody put out, the Bloomberg had recently, which I think just nails the case in spades. There's 60 trillion of investment grade bonds. Now we're not talking about commercial paper or bank loans or all the rest of it, but tradable bonds in the world outstanding today. 30 trillion of that, half, is trading at a negative real yield after inflation. Now, how can you run a capitalist or any kind of economy in the world where money, long-term money, and this is what the bond market is, it trades at a negative real yield? That's nuts, and it's just I think, ultimate measure of how far off the deep end this whole modern regime of central banking has gone. Now, the odd thing is that as long as this bubble somehow keeps hanging in there, stays levitated, more or less all the politicians and public policy makers of the world have been euthanized. They're not even worried about these things. In other words, this is a 12 alarm crisis to see half of the debt in the world trading in negative real terms, and there isn't one politician worried about it, or even more than a handful of central bankers. And it's the greatest problem of economic, history in modern times.
I mean, do the deficits or the debt, does it even matter to the US anymore, or will we just simply keep printing the mighty dollar to solve all our problems?
Well, I think you could only go so far because, after all, if you could print infinite amounts of money indefinitely, they would have discovered that long ago, and everybody would live a very happy life. You wouldn't have to work. Every Thursday afternoon, you go outside, pick up the dollars they dropped out of the helicopter, and then go back to enjoying, whatever your favorite movie was or whatever you were doing. The world doesn't work that way. All right. You have to have investment productivity. You have to have savings to fund real investment. And the central banks of the world are wrecking all of that and creating the illusion that they can generate prosperity with fiat credit, snatched out of thin air. Again, people should recognize this is a progressive disease. In other words, it starts small and it just keeps inching up and growing. But let's go back to the year 2000, which wasn't that long ago, this new century. The balance sheets of all the central banks of the world combined were, sort of in the range of 2 to 3 trillion. Okay, that had taken hundreds of years to get there. If you look at all the central banks from their moment of creation. Today, the central banks of the world have 25 trillion of combined balance sheets. So that means that in less than 2 decades, the balance sheets of the central banks have exploded by 22 trillion, and every dollar of that 22 trillion of increased assets was paid for with, guess what? Not earnings, not savings, not existing forms of purchasing power. It was purchased by the central banks by hitting the buy key on their computers and creating, credit out of thin air that they then transferred to the banks who sold them the bonds. 22 trillion of financial fraud by the central banks over the last 2 decades. And yet, if you hear the Wall Street talking heads, they would have you believe, this is the greatest time ever, and the stock market goes from one high to the next, and that we're all going to live happily ever after. This is the greatest fantasy, financial fantasy that's ever, unfortunately, been foisted upon the people of the world.
Yeah, I mean, is the reason why we touched a little bit on that magical 2% number, but is the reason why the Fed is so fixated on that 2% inflation rate because of their fear of recessions, and they're trying their best to make sure that recession doesn't happen? It's almost outlawed.
Well, the 2% goal, and I call it 2.000%, that's how
The
precise
decimals.
they think they can be, is plucked out of thin air. There is no empirical evidence historically or in other countries that 2% leads to better prosperity or growth than 1.5% or 2.5% or 0%. It's just an entirely made up number by these Keynesians who have taken control of the Fed, like John Williams, the current new president of New York Fed. There wasn't even a quantitative target, as you know, till January 2012. Inflation targeting was a theory of kind of an academic theory of Keynesian economists generated during the 1990s. You asked me at the beginning here about Volcker. If he and I were talking today, I'd be talking today versus the early 1980s. In the early 1980s, nobody heard of inflation targeting. It would have been considered either idiocy or heresy, or sort of a nutty idea. So there's no basis for it. It is simply an excuse for central bankers to keep pumping credit and fiat credit and liquidity into the financial system, because that makes the stock market go up and that makes them heroes. Okay, it's an excuse. It's a dangerous thing. Now, on the other hand, in my day, when I went through the 70s, I was a congressman during the 1970s from Michigan. Uh, we had a terrible period of double-digit inflation. There wasn't the remotest thought in the world that the central bank ought to be in the business of promoting inflation. The central bank was in the business of, fighting inflation. And in those days, the common sense notion of price stability was zero, zero point 0.0. Where did they come up with 2%? Well, Paul Volcker said recently, where did this come from? This is Paul Volcker, the greatest central banker of modern times. And he pointed out that 2.0% after 36 years cuts the value of your savings in half. What's the point of that? Why are we attacking, punishing, savaging, really, savers
Yeah.
when the savings function is the most important function in a capitalist economy? After all, it's easy to spend. It's easy to spend money you've earned, and it's even easier to spend money you borrow, right? And so therefore, the spending problem, which the Keynesians are constantly focusing on, is the wrong problem. That's easy. But people will never stop spending if there's availability of the wherewithal to do it. The real challenge in capitalism is savings, to get people to defer part of their current earnings for investment and for future rewards. But when you put when you have the interest rate practically at zero worldwide, what is the incentive for saving? There isn't. We're just wrecking the whole fundamental basis for a healthy economy.
Yeah, you touched on something pretty interesting where I don't know when it started, but when the Fed speaks today, the entire world listens as if their life depended on it, and why is so much hinging on their decisions of this 12-person Fed system. But as you mentioned, it wasn't the case in the 80s in your time with Mr. Volcker. Do you have any thoughts as to how or when we arrive to this state today where every word the Fed says is life dependent?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question, and I think it all really started in 1987 when Greenspan became Fed chairman. Ronald Reagan mistakenly was informed mistakenly that he was a gold bug, hard money man. Greenspan was in his earlier career as an economist, but basically he wanted to be popular, and so he essentially created a theory of central banking that I call bubble finance, and that is if you can keep the stock market going higher, that will generate confidence, the so-called wealth effect. And from the wealth effect, you will get more investment. The more investment, will get more growth. And so therefore, the economy will do better and better. In other words, the whole idea was if we can levitate and boost the stock market, all kinds of good things will happen from that. That's where the Fed got off track. It became worse and worse over time with each crisis. And, in the year 2000, the Fed and Greenspan should have learned their lesson that wealth effects only create eventually massive bubbles. Then the dot-com collapsed. What happened to the NASDAQ 100, it dropped by 85% over 2.5 years. They should have learned their lesson, but they just went back to the well and doubled down and did it more. So now what we have in the world is a cult of the stock market, a lunatic belief that it has to go off day in, day out, month in, month out, that there's never any correction, and that the only direction is skyward, and that all of policy, all of even business activity ought to be subordinated to whatever it takes, to use Draghi's idiotic term, whatever it takes to keep the stock market going higher. That's why I heard some people in the last day or two on Bloomberg, supposedly a professional economist, chastising the Germans for a story that leaked that they might be thinking of abandoning their balanced budget in order to, spend money on green energy or whatever. But the point is, every Keynesian economist 40 years ago said that after 10 years of economic expansion, at the top of a 121-month cycle, you're supposed to have a surplus. You're supposed to be reeling in, the fiscal accounts, so that when a real crisis or deep recession comes, you can go the other way. I don't say I ever bought that, but the point is, today, the Germans are being chastised for thinking about, no, not even thinking about, for leaking by some disgruntled guy in a bureaucracy somewhere, the possibility that they might abandon the balanced budget at the very time that the one country in the world that's got a semblance of fiscal sobriety, is the and so the economists was then said, well, why are they sticking with the balanced budget? And the answer was, well, they have bad political culture. In other words, the German people actually believe in financial sobriety, and that's a terrible thing. They should listen to us economists and start borrowing like hell because that's the ticket to prosperity. So, we not only have a bad regime, a destructive regime of central banking, but we have a corruption of thinking, a corruption of intellectual life, so to speak, on Wall Street, where it's loaded with so-called strategists and economists, and they're all just, day traders posing as economists, who, believe in what I call an economic theory that has one purpose, and that is to explain why you should buy stock, some more stock. That's all it is. It's nonsense.
Yeah, well, I guess we that's why we started off by saying the world's a crazy place. But I hear this phrase all the time, especially because the stock market is just running wild right now. There's a time to make money, and there's a time to protect what you made. In your opinion, where should investors be right now? Making money in the markets, or starting to take their chips off the table and protect what they made?
I think they should be fleeing the casino, as I call it. It's not a market; it's a casino, gambling joint. With all deliberate speed. These markets are not safe. They are extremely unstable, fragile. We are at the greatest bubble peak yet, even beyond what we had in 2000 or 2008. And therefore, the risk reward of staying in this market, owning a treasury bond that yesterday morning, a 10-year bond was trading at 1.6%, that's crazy. Its yield is going to go up, its price is going to go down. And if you can wait out the maturity and collect the cash 10 years from now, more power to you. But if the bond, when the crisis come and the price of the bond drops 10 or 20%, and you've lost the meager interest that you have accumulated, what you're going to do is panic, sell it, have a big loss, and the stock market obviously is even worse. So this is a time for capital preservation, for getting out of the bond market, out of the stock market, for getting liquid, for getting into cash, and getting into what I would call safe assets, safe haven assets, which are gold or other precious metals.
Yeah, speaking of gold, August 15th, the 48th anniversary of the temporary closing of the gold window is coming up, where President Nixon, he temporarily closed it again back in 71. I know you're a young man back then, 71, still a young man looking good, but are you able to recall your reaction when you first heard about the US dollar not having a link to gold anymore? And how was the reaction from your colleagues or the nation in general?
Well, I was a young guy working on Capitol Hill. I was a legislative assistant. I
Mhm.
didn't have any great training in economics at the time. In fact, I'd gone to Harvard Divinity School and had just gotten out of there and went to Washington and was working for a Republican congressman. But even with the limited knowledge and understanding I had at the time, it was a big shock because it was not Nixon was doing everything in that single event of August 1971, Camp David weekend, and the announcement on a Sunday night. I can remember it, hearing it come over the radio for some reason, as clear as a bell. But he not only, essentially dumped Bretton Woods and the link of the dollar to gold, but he put on wage and price controls on the entire economy and interest rate controls. And then they had a big increase in the budget in order to, it was all Keynesian stimulus. Every single thing that you could do wrong, they did wrong in that package. And one of the greatest ironies of history is that at the time, Nixon at Camp David that weekend was surrounded by a bunch of so-called free marketers. Okay, George Shultz, who went on to be famous as Secretary of Labor then, but Secretary of State, and I suppose there's some great statesman. was there as the personal mouthpiece of Milton Friedman, and they told Nixon to sever the link to gold and have a float of let the market determine the value of the dollar. Well, Friedman was really a closet Keynesian. I just call him a freshwater Keynesian because he lived near Lake Michigan, as opposed to all the Harvard economists who were saltwater Keynesians because they lived, on the Atlantic coast. But the point was, he just wanted to do it through a different mechanism. The saltwater Keynesians wanted to use fiscal tools, the budget, to boost the economy, to stimulate, blah, blah, blah. Friedman wanted to do it through through the monetary lever. But the problem was, once you unleashed the central bankers, he was a naive man, and he did not understand that they would be under excruciating pressure always to make it easier for gamblers on Wall Street and for borrowers, the saviors of the world, be damned. Okay, that's where it started, and it was just, one decade after another, we got deeper in the soup. The greatest economic sin of modern history occurred at Camp David that weekend in August 1971. We've been paying the price ever since because we basically left true free market capitalism behind, particularly in the financial sector. And increasingly, we drifted into a state-controlled, central bank-dominated, bubble-ridden, debt-ridden financial system that sooner or later is going to extinguish prosperity entirely.
In your opinion, if you're in charge, David, is there any way to fix this and make America great again?
Well, it's pretty late in the hour, let me tell you. I mean, on paper, it's fixable. How you would ever get it implemented is the big problem. But I think there are two steps. One, we ought to have a balanced budget amendment. That's the only way you're ever going to control Congress and the interest groups and all the big spenders. Balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. And second, we ought to abolish the FOMC and get the Fed out of the macro management business and back to its original role as a backup liquidity supplier, as Carter Glass defined it. Now, there's many other things to do. We've got to shrink the welfare state. We've got to stop having interventions and wars all around the world. But the two biggest things are fiscal rectitude and sobriety and reeling in the Fed.
David Stockman, we thank you for spending time with us, and I know you got to run, and I do wish you all the best.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
Thank you, David. Hope we can do it again sometime.
Yes, sure will.
That was David Stockman, the former budget director of the Reagan administration. For more of his insights on the global economy, please visit his website, davidstockmanscontracorner.com.